Will you pray with me? Spirit of the living God, pour out your love and your grace onto this place. In this preaching moment, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in thy sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I learned a new word this week that I want to share with all of you. It is scopisthesia. Can you say that with me? Scopisthesia. It is, let's see if this works, the subjective human experience of sensing that someone is staring at you. It's pretty creepy, huh? Has anyone ever had that feeling? Other than your Siri, that is definitely watching you. But like, have you ever been sitting somewhere and been like, no, it's just me, I'm just the paranoid one in the room? Okay, well, it is a real thing that has been studied by real life scientists. According to social psych, some people do believe that it's bunk science, that we can't actually perceive that we are being watched. But according to social psychologist Elan Shearer, the ability to detect another person's gaze may be because of something that's going on with our eyes, the way that our eyes are shaped, that we are detecting subconsciously people's gaze as well as a part of their nonverbal communication. And this is a thing that's probably a part of our evolutionary adaptation, that this is a skill that humans have gotten that's helped us to survive. So when we're being watched, we can potentially adapt. So when our gospel lesson begins today with one Sabbath when Jesus went to share a meal in the home of one of the leaders of the Pharisees, they were watching him closely. I wonder, did Jesus feel the eyes on him? Did that sense inform how he behaved in this space? I ask all this because as I was reading the gospel lesson today, I found Jesus' behavior, and I think this is the correct theological term, to be a little weird. We find Jesus sitting at the dinner table of a local Pharisee leader. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Why is Jesus going to dinner with the people who are constantly questioning him on his teachings and his healings? I have two theories about this. First, I don't think Jesus painted entire groups of people with the same brush. He didn't assume that because one or two Pharisees were difficult and gave him a hard time, all of them were difficult. He understood who they were. Pharisees are, this is why we can't do this because then I get distracted. Pharisees were meticulous interpreters of the Torah, believing Jews had to be scrupulous about things like eating and tithing and ritual purity. While these theologians agitated Jesus from time to time, it's wrong to assume that they are all bad and out to get Jesus. And I think Jesus knew this. My second part of my theory is that I think Jesus was a I'll eat with anybody kind of guy. He did not shy away from his critics or his naysayers. And he continually puts himself in their orbit. Have you noticed that he just keeps going up and hanging out with Pharisees and Sadducees and all these folks who keep questioning him? So the first takeaway from this story is I think Jesus doesn't paint everyone with a broad brush, and that Jesus is constantly seeking connection with those who disagree with him. The meal continues. Now our lectionary, and I apologize to Mark, I should have marked this. Our lectionary skips some verses. Mark did read them, which is good, but they skipped it probably because it was a little redundant from last week, but I do think it bears highlighting. Before the dinner really kicks off, Jesus does indeed heal another person just like he did last week. It says, a man suffering from abnormal swelling of the body was there. Jesus asked the lawyers and Pharisees, does the law allow healing on the Sabbath or not? But they said nothing. Jesus took hold of the sick man, cured him, and let him go. He said to them, suppose your child or ox fell into a ditch on the Sabbath day. Wouldn't you immediately pull him out? But they had no response. The Pharisees had no response. That is a new look for them. Remember last week when Jesus healed the woman who was bent over, and he healed her on the Sabbath, and the synagogue leader criticized the move because in his view, work wasn't allowed on the Sabbath, and healing was work. But then Jesus, in a pretty dramatic way, drops a truth bomb on him in front of his entire community by reminding him that the Sabbath is in commemoration of God leading the Israelites out of oppression, and therefore healing of the Sabbath is indeed an act of Sabbath. So maybe the no response is because they still disapprove of what Jesus has done, but they don't want to get schooled by him again in front of everybody. Or maybe their mothers just taught them to be polite at the dinner table. Whatever the case, I think that the silence in the room suggests to me that there was tension in the room. And I bet, knowing Jesus, that he felt that tension. Jesus was a pretty perceptive guy. He could feel the staring. He could hear the sounds of nervous chewing. And so what does Jesus do? Does he politely turn to his bread and wine and eat quietly for the rest of the meal? Not my Jesus, no. He leans into the awkward and keeps pressing forward. Sometimes I think we think that conflict is bad or conflict is sinful. And I don't think it is. And I think Jesus proves that time and again. Jesus was not conflict avoidant. It's how we act amid conflict. But I think here Jesus is demonstrating how we as Christians should be amid conflict and amid the potential of condemnation from those around us. So the second takeaway that I want you to think about as we're going through this story is Jesus does what he knows is good and holy, even if it makes those around him uncomfortable, and even if he might be sparking debate. The meal continues. And our scripture says, Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, and he told them a parable. Isn't that interesting? We begin the story with Jesus being watched. But then in turn, Jesus is watching them, watching their behavior, noticing what they are doing. Jesus says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And then he says, when you receive an invitation, go and sit at the least important place. When I got to this point in our gospel lesson, my first thought was, this sounds less like Jesus and more like Emily Post. Did Jesus go to cotillion? Why is Jesus spending time dictating to people where they should sit? To answer this, let's discuss really quick, this is for you, Dr. Addy, a quick moment of eating culture in the Greco-Roman world. Love a history lesson. The room that would have been set up to look something like this. It's very casual. I told Mark, it kind of feels like it's a setup at a Benihana, but nobody asked me. That there's 3-sided tables. This is called a triclinium, and it was designed so that people could have equal access to the food, conversation, and entertainment. And yes, they were laying down and eating. At the Last Supper, they were reclining. I'm so sorry. Leonardo da Vinci totally ruined it for you. It was designed to provide equal access to food and conversation and entertainment. However, each position at this table was assigned, and all the guests immediately knew their rank in relation to where they were sitting. Whoever was most proximate to the host was seen as more privileged and more powerful and more respectable. Jesus tells his listeners, sit beneath where you belong. Our modern ears will hear this as a pretty typical Jesus-y message on humility. But we have to remember that in the Greco-Roman world, humility was not considered a virtue. It was seen as weak. Honor, having merits and being rewarded for them publicly, was the driving ethos of the Greco-Roman world. Your place at the table was earned through your strength, your wit, and your power. So what Jesus is suggesting here is for his listeners to ignore everything that they had ever been taught about how to function in society. And you've got to imagine that there were some jaws on the floor when he said this. To amp up the awkwardness, he then turns to his host, the Pharisee, and says, when you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you have a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. As we've said in the last, and really since I've started and we've been talking about the Gospel of Luke, a big theme in the Gospel of Luke is that he is challenging the social norms and systems to liberate the oppressed. Jesus is sitting literally at the table of the privileged and challenging them, saying, resist the urge to be transactional. Go and be humble. He is then telling them, you're going to receive a blessing, not in this earthly realm, but in the kingdom of heaven. He is putting out on the table an outrageous, irrational proposition that would have countered the common sense in that room that day. It might even counter the common sense in this room today. But this is the thing. Just because it seems outrageous and irrational doesn't mean that Jesus is not being deadly serious about what he's saying. So what does this mean for us? Every couple of months in the media, whether it's Fox News or the New York Times, an article comes out about how the church in America is dying. Denominations are falling apart and how churches are increasingly irrelevant. It is true that churches are closing and budgets are shrinking and pews are not being filled like they once were. We know that. We've seen that. And this is a cause of grief for many. For a long time, churches were tied to Americans' social capital. One's membership to a church was a point of pride. A church was a place to network. A church was a place to have belonging. And unfortunately, church was a place where prestige and power could be wielded by clergy and lay people alike. This is still true in some places, but those trend lines are going down. If I opened it up, we could be here all day naming who is to blame for this. But I think the more crucial question that we should be asking ourselves is that what the church was ever supposed to be like in the first place? Jesus said to the Pharisee, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your sisters or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. Too many American churches have been built upon inviting our friends, our brothers, our sisters, our relatives, our rich neighbors to come into our space and worship with us. On the face of it, there's nothing wrong with this. We want to invite everybody in our orbit because we want them to know the love and joy of Christ, and we care about them. But in too many churches, our conversations about evangelism often veer into discussions of wealth and community prestige a church could have if it only had younger folks or wealthier folks or more powerful folks and people that we like and that we understand. The question that Jesus is hoping we get to is this: do we evangelize and extend hospitality with the same gusto to the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and the otherwise different? For too long, the American church has functioned more like a country club than a fellowship of sinners redeemed by God's grace who seek to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. So in this moment of compare and despair, in this moment of scarcity, real or perceived, we, as those of us who have remained committed to being church and to being churched with each other, have a chance to get back to our roots, to not being a club, to not being a corporation, but to being a movement of Jesus Christ again. It gives us a chance to say, the world is telling us that we are on the verge of being downsized, but I know, by God's grace, we are being right-sized. The world is telling us that surviving means keeping the wrong people out and the right people in, but God is calling us to make the table more expansive, more accessible, and more hospitable. Almost every community of faith wrestles with the questions that come out of a text like this one, where Jesus is being weird. Jesus is pointing